Good morning. It's great to see so many people here early in the morning to talk about parking. That can only mean one of two things. Either it's the Build Maine conference or somebody's trying to build affordable housing in the neighborhood. Today it's the Build Maine conference. And it's great to be back in Maine because this particular region is very near and dear to my heart because I went to summer camp here and later worked at that summer camp about 10 miles away from here. Pine Island, for those of you who are from the area. And I was thinking about this experience, and I was thinking, there's a lot to like in this summer camp. Look at this. We have a diversity of housing types. We have a walkable neighborhood. And we have a variety of transportation options. Although what you see in the foreground here is actually them all looking for a parking spot. But no, it turns out this was just a brief respite from the real world, which is dominated, of course, by car travel, and at the beginning and end of every car journey, the search for a parking space. Now, of course, as you probably know, the search for a parking space drives people crazy. Donald Shoup, the late great professor of parking studies, liked to say that thinking about parking takes place in the reptilian cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain said to govern territoriality, aggression, and ritual display, like parking in a fire lane, for example. Move your cars. There's all kinds of examples of this, but one of my favorites comes from Chicago, where there's a blog called Chicago Dibs Tumblr. And this blog keeps track of all the objects that Chicagoans use to save their parking spots after they've shoveled them out after a snowstorm. So you see some of these objects here. And I look at these and I always think that the implication here is that you would be beaten over the head with the object in question if you were to take that spot. And it's interesting because there are, I think, very few other domains in which government explicitly endorses vigilante justice as a means of regulating ownership over space, but this is one of them. And in Boston, which is where I live now, basically a few years ago, they tried to limit this practice to just 48 hours after a snowfall. And one of the councilmen stood up and he said, "This speaks to the basic principle of what it means to be an American." He said, like the gold miners and the pioneers, residents have a right to stake their claims. And the practice remains unchanged to this day. So when I think about parking, I'm thinking specifically about the search for a perfect parking space. And what do I mean by perfect? I mean it is free, it's convenient, which is to say no more than 8 feet away from the doorway that you're trying to enter after you leave the car, and it's available the moment you arrive. And this is, I think, what most of us have in mind when we think about the perfect parking space. Someone called this rockstar parking. But the truth is that these three attributes constitute a trilemma. And it's very, very difficult to achieve all three of these attributes. Closer? Okay. It's very, very difficult to achieve all three of these attributes without destroying the place that you came to park at in the first place. So many of our communities wind up with what we refer to as the parking problem. And while this may seem dire, as I was speaking to somebody just yesterday afternoon here who was saying, the only thing worse than having a parking problem is not having a parking problem, because that means nobody wants to go to your place. But what I want to argue to you today is that the search for this perfect parking space has been a key determinant in the way that our built landscape looks, feels, functions, from architecture to walkability to the capital E environment, to even municipal finance, and of course transportation. And it turns out that by prioritizing this perfect parking space, we have made enormous sacrifices in all of these other domains. We have sacrificed our ability to provide affordable housing, to build walkable neighborhoods, to preserve historic structures, and to create a sustainable environment, and to provide a way for people to get around without their cars, of course. We've turned our urban environment from the pre-parking architecture, architecture BP, which looks more or less like this, or, of course, like that, right here in Skowhegan, into something that looks more like this. And so the question that I'm going to try and get to today is, how did this happen? And then what can we do to fix this development? So the parking problem is basically as old as the road itself. We find stories about parking from ancient Mesopotamia, from ancient Rome, but of course it gets much more complicated when Henry Ford rolls out the Model T, and especially the development of cars in which you can leave parked for days, if not weeks at a time, outside without any problem, right? One woman in Muncie, Indiana, spoke for a nation when she said that she had bought a car before she installed indoor plumbing, because she said you can't go to town in a bathtub. And the results of this, predictably, were parking chaos on the streets of our towns and cities. So here you see photos of Detroit and New York, streets absolutely swarmed with cars. And contemporary observers diagnosed that this was, of course, a traffic problem. It was very difficult to get anywhere. But at the root of this traffic problem, they felt, was a parking problem, because it was the inability of people to leave those cars that was causing all this traffic to pile up. As people circled the block looking for parking, they double parked, they triple parked, they just left their cars in the middle of the street. It was total chaos. But the nation was busy doing other things at that particular moment, and so we had to wait until the end of the Second World War, at which time the nation finally turns its attention to the parking problem. And here, this is a cartoon from the Los Angeles Times in 1945, where you see this giant gorilla is labeled "Downtown Parking Problem." And this King Kong-like figure is hulking over downtown Los Angeles, possibly about to destroy the city. And this more or less sums up the way that people at this time thought about what the importance of the parking problem. And this surprised me when I started researching this book, because I thought, well, you know, America in the 1940s and 50s, a lot going on. But it turns out our great urban thinkers of the time were laser focused on the parking problem as absolute top of the list of things that affected the viability of our downtowns and their ability to withstand decentralization and the flight of money and people and businesses to the suburbs. The University of Michigan, I think, summed this up nicely in a 1950 report where they said the downtown parking problem is three-dimensional. It exists in time, in space, and in people's minds, which is to say, you can solve those first two, but if you don't deal with that mental block that people have around parking, then you're not going to get very far. It was a subject of such interest that there was, in fact, a children's board game about parking. Can't imagine why this one hasn't become a classic like Monopoly or Life. And of course, it was a subject of great interest on the part of the automobile lobby. There was General Motors produced a video from 1954. It's on YouTube. You should watch it afterwards if you want to get a sense of what this was like. They have a quote in the movie where they say, "What brings up store sales today is parking space. It's as important to volume as shelf spaces and display windows. Best investment a town can make, lots of parking." And in fact, towns did make that investment. Here you see an image from Flint, the place where General Motors was founded and headquartered, and they actually paint on the side of the building a diagram to help you find a parking space. So it's parking in 3 dimensions. And basically, cities did exactly that. They created lots and lots of parking. This is a before and after illustration of Denver, 1930 and 1968. This is an illustration by Alfred Twu that they made for my book. But as you can see here, this is actually an image taken from a blimp of Denver that shows this same transformation. Quite dramatic. And of course, a lot of that empty space ended up being used for parking spaces even after some of the urban renewal projects had been completed. And here's what it looked like on the ground. And I want to emphasize that this process also was very important in small towns. I think there's a few reasons why smaller cities and towns are in particular vulnerable to this phenomenon that Mark Childs described as parking spaces eating away at the town like moths devouring a lace wedding gown. And that's first because small towns have relatively high car ownership rates, so lots of people are already driving. They have a relatively fragile urban fabric. If you destroy one block of Main Street for parking, you might not have that many blocks left. There is always the temptation to ruin your local finances by investing in a giant $40 million garage. Many of the main roads are run by the state, which in certain places presents problems in terms of slowing down cars, establishing on-street parking, redesigning roads, creating crosswalks. And of course, small towns almost always actually do have enough parking. So all the more tragic to see parking become such a priority in communities of every size. So how did this happen? There were a few things that happened. There was the process of urban renewal. There was disinvestment and abandonment, which created land where parking appeared to be the highest and best use. But most importantly, there was a change in the zoning code in just about every American town and city, which established parking requirements to go along with every single land use. So if you would like to, for example, renovate an old spinning mill in Skowhegan, there is a book that will tell you exactly how many parking spaces you need for each apartment, for the hotel, for the event space, and so on. It might not be enough today, but as Don Shoup would say, you don't build the church for Easter Sunday. Now, these books have an incredibly precise description of various land uses and how much parking they require. I didn't want to pick on any particular community, but I did pick these out from a town in Maine that requires 2 parking spaces for every dwelling unit. It requires 4 for every lane in a bowling alley. So we may be bowling alone, but the parking requirements haven't caught up to that. And 6 to 10 for every neighborhood grocery store. So if you wonder why it's hard to open, a corner store and get fresh groceries into a community today, maybe it's because you need to reserve, 3,000 square feet for parking spaces. Now, when it comes to creating parking, these laws really worked wonders. We have here images of Atlanta and Seattle, bottom left, and then Los Angeles at right, showing just how much parking was created in these communities. In Los Angeles, it's 14% of all the incorporated land in the county. So a good chunk of land just being used to park cars, more than for, in fact, the streets and the freeways and the moving lanes on those thoroughfares. Here's Columbia, South Carolina. They've got 37% of their central city devoted to parking. And by the way, this is just pure parking parcels. This doesn't include parking that is occurring on street or parking garages that are nestled inside buildings. And so the estimates today are we've got at least 3 and as many as 6 parking spaces per car in the country. And some of those cars are in motion, so they might not need those parking spaces. So generally speaking, a great surplus of parking has been created. Parking problem solved. Just kidding. These laws didn't actually solve the parking problem, and I think they didn't work the wonders that we thought they would for several reasons. But it's important to understand the ways in which these laws have backfired. The first is that creating parking costs a lot of money. Despite the fact that nobody wants to pay for it ever, it is an expensive thing to build. It takes up a lot of land, and if you have to build it in a structure, or even worse, underground, you could be looking at potentially $50,000 to $100,000 a space in parking costs. And if you're trying to build affordable housing, and that's a requirement that's tacked on, well, that's an enormous tax that's being passed on to the occupants of those buildings. Second, parking creates a lot of space, as I mentioned, so even if you can afford it and you're building it at surface, you're taking up a lot of room. And then third, the laws are designed to require this parking for each individual land use individually. So there's no overlap. And so even though different features of the city require parking and get used at different times of day, the parking rules do not accommodate for that fact. And so we've created a great surplus, but at the same time, when it's peak moment for the Build Maine conference, you might find that you can't just park in the parking lot of the convenience store across the street. In terms of housing costs, I mean, this is probably the biggest issue in a lot of your communities. It's very expensive to build housing, and it's very expensive to rent, and many communities are suffering from that fact. There was a study by the Government Accountability Office in 2018. Parking structures were associated with a per unit cost increase of about $56,000 in California and Arizona, or about 27% of the median per unit cost. So adding on a quarter of the price of the unit for required parking, regardless of whether the tenants and future occupants of that building are actually going to want that parking. And as you can see on the left in this graphic from the Parking Reform Network, in spatial terms, parking requires quite a lot of space. So even if you can afford it, you may be dedicating more than half your site to parking, more space for parking than for the actual use of land. It has also had a kind of a strong effect on the types of structures we can create. Because parking is expensive and it takes up space, if you're operating in a relatively high-value place where you can afford to create a parking structure, you'll end up building something on the right, like a parking podium building. And if you're operating where land is pretty cheap, you can build surface parking, which is what you see on the left. But anything in the middle becomes very hard to pencil. And one developer described this to me as the valley of the high parking requirements. This type of missing middle development that everybody wants to create in their community has become very, very difficult to build because you don't have enough land for surface parking and you don't have enough money for structured parking. And so you end up just not building anything at all. This is a neat illustration, or rather photos of this effect from Cincinnati, where you see the Over the Rhine neighborhood on the left, built before parking requirements, kind of bifurcating into these two types of neighborhoods that we tend to build today, either the parking podium building upper right, or the single-family home where the garage is the largest room in the house on the bottom right. And so you can sort of watch as the urban environment begins to dissolve under the force of these parking requirements. And we've seen this happen in so many communities where if you have no parking required, you get something that basically looks like your typical Main Street USA. And then as you begin to require more parking, you can watch as the structure dissolves into something that looks more like a Taco Bell. And right, so the architect Louis Sullivan said form follows function, but Don Shoup would have said form follows parking requirements. And that these are actually the absolute determinant of the way things look. And people like to think about Houston as a city with no zoning, but the reason that Houston looks exactly like every other city in spite of the fact that it has no zoning is because it still has parking requirements. So they were willing to get a little crazy with the zoning, but they weren't willing to go that far. And so we ended up with an urban environment that looks a lot like this. And of course, this has enormous consequences, not just for affordable housing and for the types of structures we build, but also for transportation. Because when you require that every parcel be more than 50% parking, you are lowering the density of the urban environment by half right off the bat. And this makes it very hard to walk places. It makes it very hard to create the density that supports transit. It just pushes destinations further apart. And then furthermore, from the perspective of somebody who's on the street, it feels dangerous and unpleasant to get around on foot, on a bike, etc. And all this has been required by law. And it didn't even solve the parking problem. And one of the reasons for that is that contrary to the expectations of these city planners who established these rules, the more parking you create, the more people end up driving. This is a neat study, which I don't expect you'll be able to read from the back of the room, but the gist of it is that the more parking that was built in cities between 1960 and 1980, the more people wound up driving between 1980 and 2000. And so in this way, parking wasn't just responding to demand for driving and for parking, it was also creating it. And so you wound up with a situation in which even after zoning for parking had created all this parking with every new and renovated land use, you still have cities pouring millions and millions of dollars into structured garages that no one is willing to pay to park in, and just taking that on with the general fund and local debt, paying for this parking that might not actually be needed, and certainly that isn't so needed that anyone's willing to pay for it. And this happens in Maine too. I don't want to single anybody out, but this is $21 million for 400 spaces, so about $52,000 a space for a local garage, public garage. So if there's one conclusion that I think people have come to over the last 20 years about parking, it's that demand for parking is elastic. And I got an illustrator to draw up a little image of me talking to you here. What we've learned is that if demand for parking is indeed elastic, and we have more parking than we need, and we do, and just about every local study confirms this, and there are real costs to that excess parking, both monetary costs but also social costs, the result is parking reform. And so over the last 10 years, you've seen an enormous number of people get very involved in this seemingly very boring sounding field of parking reform. Now this could be you here on the right, being a parking reformer and experimenting with this field, which I think the reason that this attracts so many reformers is that it's so relatively easy to understand. You don't need a degree in structural engineering to count the number of spaces in the parking lot and say, you know what, it turns out this wasn't a necessary investment for this business to make. So there's 4 things that are happening. People are counting parking spaces, they're building fewer parking spaces, they're sharing them, and they're managing them, which is a nice way of saying they're requiring people to pay for on-street parking. But I didn't want to put that in the slideshow in case this ends up on the internet, you know? So first, counting more. I mean, this seems really self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised by how many communities don't even know how many parking spaces they have or how occupied they are. But of course, now we have this incredible technology that can just illuminate how many parking spaces we have, and then, as you see on the right, even make those parking spaces available to people who are looking for them in ways that weren't possible even 10 years ago. In New York City, my hometown, they opened up these parking spaces for restaurants to use during COVID, as they did in many places. It was a phenomenon that seemed to change the face of the city overnight, and it only took 9,000 parking spaces out of an estimated 2 million. The second step is to build less parking. This is a study out of Seattle that showed when the city relaxed its parking requirements around transit, they wound up building 17,000 fewer parking spaces than the old rules would have required. And that was just over a 5-year period. So with the going rate of a Seattle parking space, this amounts to a savings of $500 million just over a period of 5 years in one city. And that's parking that otherwise would have been built and then didn't get built. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Seattle was the only American city that saw its bus ridership increase during the decade between 2010 and 2020. Because these decisions we make about land use have a knock-on effect on transportation patterns. This is a map that shows the communities in the United States that have gotten rid of their parking requirements entirely. This is probably already out of date. Some big cities that have done this include Austin and San Jose, pretty car-oriented places. There have been a number of statewide reforms that are not visible here. Red states like Montana, blue states like Colorado. Connecticut has just done away with parking requirements. I don't think the governor has signed that yet, but that's, I think, the first state on the East Coast to try statewide preemption that will allow people to decide how much parking they want to build with their projects. And you've seen architectural forms start to respond to this. This is Everett, Massachusetts, which is an industrial city near Boston. They were getting buildings like the one on the left, where the entire ground floor was always being used as a parking lot, and they decided that this was ruining their streetscape. It was cutting up their sidewalk with driveways. They got rid of their parking requirements, and in addition to permitting builders to be more flexible, it also freed up that land that was previously being used for parking, and so they got this 100% affordable complex on the right that was built on land that was supposed to be a parking garage. Here's some other examples of architecture, post-parking requirement architecture that's being built. Hartford, Tempe, Minneapolis, Miami. These are some of the cities that have been experimenting, and as you can see, you're getting a return to the kind of street-facing, small setback, lot line architecture that once characterized the American city and provided so much flexible and affordable housing arrangements for people, but became impossible, illegal and expensive to build because of the parking requirement. Fayetteville, Arkansas, I know we're going to hear more about this later, but this is a city where they relax parking requirements for local businesses, which can be an enormous pressure as you're starting a business, taking on all this risk, and on top of that, the city wants you to buy 20 parking spaces. It turns out that when you're starting a business, this can be a huge impediment, and so they've seen that the flexibility has led to more business creation. Los Angeles has done something interesting where they've exempted historic buildings in their downtown from parking requirements. No such luck for this Mill building, but here in LA, they had this beautiful early 20th century skyscraper architecture that had basically been dormant because it didn't have enough parking to be converted into new uses. And as soon as they got rid of that parking requirement in 2000, they saw thousands of apartments open up in these old historic buildings. And one of the beautiful things is downtown LA is a major employment center. It's full of commercial garages. So where do these people park? Well, they still own cars, but they park them in those garages that tended to empty out at 5 p.m. when all the downtown workers went home. So it was a really efficient use of that space. And then finally, also from Los Angeles, accessory dwelling units, backyard cottages have been taking off in a number of places. It's a very flexible housing type, also impossible to build when you require that each one of these include a bunch of parking spaces. You can't really see it because it's cut off, but the ADU is actually on the back right of this. That's the main house you're looking at. Right, and so now you're all thinking, okay, it's all well and good, but let's get down to business. Where am I gonna park? So, one thing we can do is share parking. Buffalo, New York is one of the first cities that got rid of its parking requirements. There's been a study of what happened since. What they've found is that the projects that made the most of these reforms were mixed-use projects, which is not surprising. Projects with a little bit of retail and a little bit of office, or projects with some commercial space and some apartments, right? This is where people are building fewer parking spaces than what had been required before. This graphic kind of illustrates how this works. If you require the maximum amount of potential parking for each individual use and you stack those on top of each other, you're creating a lot of redundant parking because those uses aren't used all at the same time of day, right? So for example, an elementary school parking lot will be empty on the weekends, and that might be when the movie theater gets the most traffic. So you can economize a lot in this way. I hear people say, this is Williamstown, Massachusetts, heard somebody there say, we need this parking lot for commencement. And it's like, you're saving this whole parking lot for an event that occurs one day a year. And making it impossible to use that space for anything else on the other 364 days of the year. But you know, there are flexible arrangements you can come up with when these big events happen to avoid spending the rest of the year with all that excess parking. And then finally, managing parking. This is Seaside, Florida. Many of you have probably heard of this. It's the kind of new urbanist flagship development in the Florida Panhandle. Everybody likes its kind of close-knit architecture. They did some very innovative things with parking, among other things, like this is a parking alley, but of course, built on gravel. Look at that narrow street. Definitely not allowed to build that anymore. But they did get one thing wrong, and Andres Duani told me this. He said, my big regret about Seaside was that we turned the main plaza into a giant parking lot. And this meant not only that it was hard, it was sort of unpleasant to be there, but you also, because there was never enough parking, you had these SUVs constantly circling round and round, waiting for a spot to open up. So it was also kind of dangerous because you had kids running around and riding bikes while these cars were circling. Now, during COVID, this place emptied out, and they decided to convert this plaza into public space. And it looked like what you see on the upper right, bottom left, you see some of the tables and chairs from the restaurants spilling into the square. This was possible because they started charging for the rest of their parking. And they made a bet. They said, you know what? We think what we're offering as a town is good enough that people are still going to come here even if they have to pay for the parking. And they were right. By the way, there is free parking that's a little further away. And in many places that charge for parking, they're not charging for all the parking. It's just the very best parking. This is made possible by technology that was invented in the 1930s, which is the parking meter. When it was first deployed, people really saw it as a miracle tool, because prior to that, cities could establish however many laws they wanted, but they never managed to actually organize this space in quite the same way that the almighty dollar could, or at least at that time probably a nickel, later a quarter, and now probably a credit card. But anyway, what they found was that this solved the problem that is recurrent in cities where you have the downtown employees who arrive first at 7 or 8 or 9 in the morning. They take all the best spots on Main Street, and then people who show up later to go to a restaurant or go to a meeting can't find a place to park and complain that there's a parking problem. Well, Oklahoma City solved this problem with the parking meter, and it doesn't need to be very much money to nudge those all-day parkers to just park maybe 2-3 blocks away. San Francisco, which you see on the left, is now trying something like this with dynamic parking pricing at their meters. What they've realized is some blocks are very much in demand. Everybody wants to park there, when even 2 or 3 blocks away, there's lots of surplus parking. And so they've adjusted the pricing of the parking meters to try and nudge people to park if they're looking for a deal in that lower cost parking, and then charge the highest rates for those most in-demand blocks. And this is working really well for them. They've seen parking occupancy on these blocks settle at around 85%, which means there's always a spot available where you want to park. And one of the funny side effects of this was that their municipal garages which you see these light green big P's on the left, their prices actually went way down because nobody ever wants to park in the garage. Everybody wants to park on the street, and the pricing that they were using prior to this was backwards. The garage was more expensive than the curb, and so everybody looked for a spot on the curb. Nobody parked in the garage. Now it's the opposite. On the right, Palisades Tahoe, ski resort, another example that illustrates the essential elasticity of parking demand. Like at Seaside, where they found that turns out families where every teenager used to drive their own car, now they all came in the same car because the parking costs money. Palisades Tahoe has managed to increase the average vehicle capacity arriving at the facility from 1 guest to closer to 4 guests. And that's because they're charging for parking. And I think part of this is also about education. Don Shoup would say the third leg of the parking stool is you have to spend that money locally, and you have to make people feel like they've made an investment in the place that they live, that they shop, that they go to, and you have to make them feel like that money is going to something that they can support. This is a screenshot from a 1966 Batman cartoon in which Batman teaches Robin about the civic virtue of paying the parking meter, and Robin's like, the Batmobile's not gonna get a ticket, and he's like, no, this is your civic duty. You have to pay the parking meter. It supports our streets and our general fund. But I don't think the general fund is a good idea, but I think that in places that have done this successfully, they've used the parking meter revenue to pay for benches and trees and crosswalks and places that make people feel like they're getting their money's worth, right? That they're getting something that's a better deal than when they park out at the mall for free. And the point is not just to affect the things that get built in the future, right? Of course, projects that are coming down the line might be able to take advantage of these new rules, of an enlightened attitude about parking provision, of an enlightened attitude about what's more important. But we also have a lot of existing parking that we can begin to use in new ways. And so these are some cities. Paris has turned some of its parking spaces into flexible spaces for games. This is a photo from Beijing, which is using what was formerly parking space to sort packages, or at least pile them up. Cambridge, Massachusetts has built bike lanes in what were formerly parking spaces, and then Brooklyn has this nice hot dog restaurant operating in a parking space. Of course, we can use these parking spaces for transportation. Electric bicycles are transforming the potential market of people who can get around on an e-bike. You need parking spaces to go away to make this space available. You can get rid of parking spaces around intersections to make them safer for people to cross. This is from Hoboken. You can turn these parking spaces into green space and provide shade, as is happening in Amsterdam. And you can turn them into bioswales like they do in Seattle to stop stormwater from flooding people's houses and overwhelming the sewer system. And then you can even do just a temporary pop-up like they did here in Columbia, South Carolina, to demonstrate to people that this space could be used for something else and help them imagine something for the future. And this was on Parking Day in September of last year. Oh, and then there's Philadelphia. I don't think this can be tried anywhere else, to be honest. This is a one-off. And if that's not enough, I just want to emphasize, we're in a period of tremendous change in terms of transportation, right? We have electric vehicles, which are upon us. We have autonomous vehicles, which are approaching. And if we're making plans for providing parking according to the same rules that were rolled out in the 1950s, we are going to be building a lot of excess and expensive parking infrastructure that's never going to be used. I don't think the change here is about getting people out of their cars forever. It's not about a war on cars. It's about the median American household has 2.2 vehicles. Can we nudge that down to 2.1, 2.0, 1.9? Can we get people to make trips that they formerly made in their car, on a bike, on foot, on transit, et cetera? Because I think, and can we make that possible for people, right? Because driving is freedom, but not being able to get around any other way is also a kind of prison. And it's also very expensive. For people who are compelled to use their car to get everywhere, the requirement, not just the parking requirement, but the requirement to own a vehicle for every member of the household or lease one is a tremendous expense that is the second largest piece of a family's budget after housing. So to the extent that we can free people from this obligation, we're offering them a tremendous gift not just in terms of social mobility, but also a monetary one, right? Can we imagine a world in which people could walk to the grocery store, in which kids could walk to school? I think this is possible, and I think the world in which this happens might be one in which our cities and towns have fewer parking spaces. Maybe those parking spaces cost a little more, but the cities and towns that result would be so much richer and fuller and fairer that we would not think twice about the parking we had lost. Thank you. And I think we have time for a few questions.
As you've noted or alluded to, perception of a lack of parking tends to be the biggest issue we face in our communities, particularly our downtowns. In all of your research, has there been effective communication, marketing, or educating campaigns that have been effective at shifting the perception? Or is it just the dollar and dynamic pricing that we have to look to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's obviously very difficult to change the habits that people have acquired over literally decades of expecting the parking to be exactly where it is. And I think, unfortunately, there's lots of things you can try, but ultimately nothing speaks as loudly as saying to people, this Main Street parking now costs $0.25 an hour. And so if you're going to be parked here for 10 hours, maybe you should park around the corner. I do think education is really important, right? It's not just like, obviously, Batman's probably moved on to other things, but I think that that's a huge component of it. And in places that try this and fail, it's often because people weren't really conscious of what was trying to be done. There's a perception of parking enforcement as being driven by raising revenue rather than by organizing this precious resource that we have, which is the true purpose of the parking meter, right? And there's a perception that parking enforcement is a sort of revenue-driven policing, right? It's not just about raising money, but it's also about catching people in cycles of fines that require them to go to court. You could lose your driver's license, et cetera. And so I think we need to stop that perception, right? I think it's important to educate people about the fact that this is not primarily about raising money. It's primarily about organizing this space.
Every city I know adopts the Vision Zero. Has any city achieved it?
I think the closest that I've seen in the United States is Hoboken, which I showed a photo of Hoboken. I haven't checked recently, but they at least went for a 7-year period without having anybody killed by a car. Now, Hoboken is not, it's probably like 80 or 100,000 people. But what they've done is this daylighting program that they've done around intersections has really increased the sight lines for drivers who are approaching those intersections. And so you can see, especially if a person, especially a small person, is about to start crossing the street in a way that's invisible when you have a large car or a truck parked right in front of that crosswalk. So I think they might be the most successful city in doing this. But of course, it's hard to compare since so many cities are different sizes.
What's gone on in Portland recently is there have been some large new housing developments and the city's easing up on the parking requirements. And even though I agree with that philosophy, what it's also caused is parking prices to go up. And in Portland, it's kind of like an oligopoly. There's the city that owns lots. There's a couple of very wealthy companies that own lots. And there's new management companies that have taken over a lot of the smaller lots and manage them for people. So it's very oligopolistic, and it's very easy for prices to go up, and they have gone up. And the result of that, aside from what you're saying, and I basically agree with your approach, is that it's driving some businesses out of the downtown because they don't want to pay $200 a month for parking for their employees when 10 years ago it was 80 or 100. So the question I'm coming to here is, have you seen any cities where the city has talked about doing parking rent control?
I haven't. And I think to the extent that cities are interested in the price of parking by commercial operators, they are often trying to put big taxes on it and make it more expensive because they want to see that land converted to other uses. Of course, it is a problem that because we're so dependent on the automobile, to allude to the earlier comment, many people think that parking is synonymous with access, and that if we lose the parking, we lose the access. And if that's true, then I think I agree that it is a big problem when parking becomes expensive to the point that people can't access it. But of course, Portland is a city where many people don't drive, and in other places where the downtown has become so vibrant that parking prices go up to that extent, right? Because if they're that high, it means there's a market for it. It means people are willing to pay for that. They may be carpooling, they may be doubling up to afford that. It means that there's a potential for people often to get around some other way. And in cities that have experienced this problem, like Boulder, Colorado, has taken some of that money from their garage proceeds and used it to buy transit passes for all the employees who work downtown. And in this way they say, yes, parking down here may be expensive, but we really want you to keep working down here. We want businesses to keep thriving. But creating, bulldozing more of downtown to create a parking lot is not an option, and nor is spending $40 million on a municipal garage.
Have you found that impact fees in place of parking has been successful in any way?
That's a great question. I mean, so one thing you could do is, instead of saying to a builder, we're going to require you to build 16 parking spaces, you could say, you have the option to pay into a city fund that goes towards, for example, providing transit passes for new residents. I think that's a reasonable solution. I think it's a better solution than requiring parking from a business that may not want it, parking that might break up the urban fabric and further contribute to the disintegration of the downtown. But I think it depends on what your problem is. I mean, if your problem is that no projects are penciling and people cannot build housing because the rents aren't high enough to justify the construction costs, and then you're saying to them on top of that, we want another $100,000 for the local transit system, then you may be sort of killing the goose altogether, right? So I think it is a question of degree. And then more generally, I think it's probably better policy to fund the improvements we want from general taxation on all existing businesses, projects, people, et cetera, rather than say every new entrant into our downtown or into our community is going to pay a special tax to support the things that we're not already sufficiently providing. So I think that is a risk there. And you do see that in some places as a way of mitigating the political problems around parking, where new buildings are permitted, but if they don't pay impact fees, they suffer another consequence, which is that the residents who live there are not entitled to have the same parking permit privileges as the residents of existing buildings. This is the case in Somerville. And so they've created a kind of two-tier system of people who live in the city where, depending on what your address is, you are either eligible to park on that public right-of-way or you're not. And so maybe that's what's necessary to finally move past this fixation on the parking problem. But I do think that that is sort of a shame in terms of thinking about this space, this parking alley, belonging to everyone.
Thank you very much. Let's give Henry a hand.
Thank you.
Round of applause. You're going to be around. People have other questions.